Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Hunaidi, and I'm a writer from southern Syria and has been a refugee since 2014 in three different countries, Lebanon, Turkey, and the US. I'm currently a political asylee in the United States, so this subject hits home, and I hope you enjoy our discussion. Today, we will be talking about refugees and migration. Usually, refugees and migrants are often discussed in a humanitarian framework that strips them of their agency and the political forces that have shaped their circumstances. This panel will hopefully aim to re-politicize the question of migrants and refugees, rooting it in struggles from below that challenge class, racial, and imperialist violence and oppression. The speakers today will address the causes of mass migration in uprisings like Syrian Revolution, in changing forces of capitalism and imperialist violence, and explore moments in recent history in which movements have led migrants and refugees where they have challenged the global regime of borders. Today, we will be asking questions like what can the various movements today, whether for solidarity with Syrian refugees or for migrants in the US, learn from these high points of struggles that we've all witnessed in the past 10 to 20 years, and from each other's historical and histories and fightback. Our speakers are, we have amazing speakers from Syria and from Turkey, from here in the US. First, I'd like to introduce Justin Akers-Chacon, and he is an activist and writer and educator who lives in San Diego, on the border region, and he is the author of No One is Illegal, Fighting Racism and State Violence on the US-Mexican Border, with Mike Davis and Radicals in the Barrio, Magonistas, Socialists, Wobblies, and Communists in the Mexican-American working class. He teaches Chicano studies and US history at San Diego City College. We have also Senay Ozden, is a cultural anthropologist from Turkey. She is the co-founder of Hamish, the Syrian cultural house in Istanbul, and hosts a weekly radio program in Turkey about Syrian refugees. Her research areas include refugees in the Middle East, the Turkish state's refugees policy, and politics of humanitarian aid. She has published numerous articles and reports on Syrian refugees in Turkey and had taught at various universities in Damascus and Istanbul. We have next Omar Dahi. He is an associate professor of economics at Hampshire College. He is the co-director of the Peace Building and State Building Program and director of the Security and Geopolitics in a Global Middle East project at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research interests are in the political economy of development in the Middle East, South-South relations, comparative regionalism, peace and conflict studies, and critical security studies. And next, we have Sana Mustafa, who is a Syrian activist based in the US. She is the Associate Director of Partnership and Engagement at Asylum Access, a founding member of the Global Refugee-led Network, and a member of the Syrian Women's Political Movement. She finished her second undergraduate degree in political science as a full scholarship recipient from Bard College in New York State. I just want to remind you all of the next panel that we will be having. It's entitled The Struggles for Kurdish Liberation in Syria and the Region. The speakers will include Özlem Goner, Dilshad Othman, Kamran Mateen, and the moderator will be Thomas Schmidinger. And it will be on Wednesday, July 22nd at 2 p.m. First, I would like to introduce Diane, who is a Lebanese-American reporter based in Chicago. She works at Borderless Magazine. And before joining Borderless Magazine as a reporter, Diane interned at the magazine and worked at the World Relief Refugee Agency. Diane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sada. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Diane Boukhadil. I'm a reporter for Borderless Magazine here based in Chicago. And Borderless Magazine is a nonprofit news outlet that covers immigration in Chicago and in the Midwest in the United States. And so our goal is to humanize stories of immigration by shining the light on the diversity, resilience, and resistance of people impacted by immigration policies today. We emphasize working with immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and their allies by empowering them so they can tell their own story and their own perspective. It is very important for journalists also to tell those stories and report in an ethical way. And so, backstory, Borderless was founded in 2017. First, it was founded as 90 Days, 90 Voices after the 90-day travel ban in the US where it was imposed. So immigration makes the world more connected, and we emphasize diversity in the people that we represent and we report on. And we have a lot of stories. Obviously, it's in English, but we also have stories that were reported in Filipino and also in Spanish, and hopefully many more. We represent a lot of culture, ethnicity, and nationalities, including from all around the world, especially even Arabs, Mexicans, from South America, Southeast Asia, all of that. And so we also have diversity in storytelling. To name a few, there's personal essays, Q&As, comics, video journalism, photography, feature stories, and of course now the coronavirus stories, which is very essential to tell right now. So our goal is to provide the best immigration coverage in Chicago. And we're doing a 5-minute reader survey because we want to improve our reporting, and also we value your feedback. And so we would appreciate it if anyone takes the survey on borderlessmag.org/survey. You can also read our stories on our website. And if you're based in Chicago, you can enter to win a $10 gift card to First Sip Cafe. And so thank you so much. And I'm very excited to listen to the panelists in this event.
Thank you so much, Diane. Hello, Senay and the speakers. So we'd like to start our discussion if everyone is tuned in. So I'd like to start with the approach regarding refugees and immigrants in the world on a global scale. Usually it's talked about in a very humanitarian language and rhetoric, and it's actually dismissed as a political one, like a political problem. What do you think is missing with this approach, and why? And I know, Senay, you have a lot to say about this if you'd like to start.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thanks for the organizers for bringing us together. And I'm very excited for this conversation and joining remarkable activists and panelists with me. I think this is a very important question about why the current approach or the current solution in the refugee response sector is very humanitarian focused. And I think there are two pieces to this. First, even the root causes of displacement are talked about in a very humanitarian lens, not political lens, despite the fact that actually the reasons for this forced displacement are all political. And so how can we talk about, about Syrian refugees without addressing the war in Syria? I'm talking about the political situation and the Assad regime war crimes and what forced people out of the country. However, we see this conversation is almost never there because it is political, and humanitarian actors and development actors would feel that this kind of steps in the way of addressing the refugee crisis. And then the other lens to it is actually the solution for the refugee crisis is also humanitarian and development focused. So we're not addressing the root causes of forced displacement, and then we're also not looking with a political lens to the solution for forced displacement. And so, for example, I would say like the refugee response sector, we call it in my field, as of now keeps focusing on the humanitarian and development approaches when talking and working on refugee issues. This is the main problem in this sector, and that's why once refugees, forever refugees. The current approach, Sarah, does not pave the way for long-term dignifying solutions. It does not treat refugees as humans who should have rights. The conversation about refugees and human rights is almost impossible in our field. And when they do happen, they happen in the context of rights for food and shelter, not the right for documentation, legal documentation, not the right for freedom of movement, not the right for legal status, not the right to work or rights at work. So unless we incorporate this human and legal rights lens into the solution, refugees will forever be refugees and dependent on host government and international aid. And I mean, if we look at what we have right now, ever since the Refugee Convention 1951, why UNHCR still exists? I mean, why? Why displacement has not, the issue of displacement has not been solved? Why refugees never returned back home? The average stay over in a refugee camp is 27 years. And so I think it's time for the sector to acknowledge that there's something lacking in our response. And if you train women on knitting and kitting in refugee camps forever, I mean, you're doing nothing. Still, they don't have the right to work. They don't have legal status. They don't have so many other things. And that's why the bottom line, people were fleeing to Europe and risking their lives in the Mediterranean. It wasn't the lack of food and shelter in Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon. It was the lack of a long-term vision. It was a lack of safety. It was a lack of rights and security. And so I do think that the sector is definitely lacking this. In my organization at Asylum Access, we focus on this. We actually focus on providing legal rights for refugees and doing policy advocacy and advocating for policies that would guarantee refugees their rights. But as I said, the other piece of it is also addressing the root causes of forced displacement. And even if we give refugees rights and in the host countries and the policies work for them, I think the bottom line is that when are we going to solve what happened, what forced them in first place to flee their home countries? And how can we make sure that they are part of the solution, they are part of the future of their home countries, they are part of the negotiations, they are part of the political transition? And that's, I would say, the other piece that in the Syrian women political movement, as Syrian women, whether inside Syria or outside Syria as refugees, we are working, and you remember with us, so we're working on Syrian women political participation in us addressing root causes back home. And so, yeah, the solution and the reasons are political. And so unless we get political, this is going to be a long-lasting problem.
Thank you so much, Sanam. Justin, hello. If you would like to talk about, to answer that question from a Mexican perspective.
Yeah, so thank you. In the United States, I would say that what had been discussed as a humanitarian issue has now been flipped into a question of criminalization and repression under the reactionary authoritarian regime of Trump. But I would argue that this has been enabled by the whole sort of political establishment here. We've seen what had been a system in which people could apply for asylum at the border now turned into a mechanism for criminalizing, incarcerating, and creating systems of repression. And now at the U.S.-Mexico border, the Trump administration has essentially closed off all asylum. And so it's pushed tens of thousands of people, mostly from Central America, but also from Mexico, other parts of Latin America, and even Africa. It's pushed people into these sort of camps all across the southern part of the U.S.-Mexico border. And it is a very political issue. It's being politicized by the right wing, by the racist, xenophobic right wing in this country. But it is very much a political issue. The most recent waves of migration coming from Central America, for instance, people are fleeing. They're fleeing, one, from economic displacement. Over the last 12, 13 years, there's been U.S. and these U.S. agreements, not really free trade, but that's what they're called. But they're really agreements that allow for the U.S. to have U.S. government to sort of open up these much smaller economies to U.S. capital, U.S. multinationals, and U.S. investors, and that's created systematic displacement. But also under the sort of cover of the war on drugs, the U.S. government, this is going back to 2005, so it's a bipartisan project, but the U.S. government has supplied weapons to Central America, especially Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, supplied weapons sort of under the sort of rubric of the war on drugs, but these weapons have fallen into the hands of these authoritarian repressive regimes used against the people, and this is one of the factors also driving migration, aside from the rise of of cartels, and drug gangs. So the current president, for instance, in Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, is actually, with very overt U.S. support, is repressing a movement of workers and medical work. Had been, up until the pandemic, there had been a very active movement for workers' rights and for healthcare and for educational rights in that country. And these movements are being brutally repressed by the regime with U.S. support. So it's a very political issue, but it's then presented and flipped as if the refugees, are now a threat to this society. So there is a tremendous humanitarian crisis on the border as we speak, because the U.S. government under Trump has implemented this what's called Remain in Mexico policy. So whereas asylum seekers could get entrance into the United States and have an opportunity to reside in the U.S. while making their case for asylum and to enter into refugee status, this Remain in Mexico policy has basically not allowed anyone to enter. The administration has basically stopped these hearings, and it's created the conditions in which there is a significant humanitarian crisis on the border. So so this is a glimpse of what's actually happening here right now.
Thank you so much, Justin. Both you and Senay have touched on the systematic displacement and the causes of mass migration, and I will get back to that as my second question, but I'd also like to address the political/humanitarian question to my other speakers, Senay and Omar. Senay, if you would like to talk about how the refugee question is asked within Turkey, and how do you feel as a Turkish speaker and a citizen of Turkey, is it even talked about in political ways within Turkey, or only in English and within the communities of the NGOs and aid?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the situation in Turkey is a bit different, I think, in the sense that actually the issue is quite politicized, but only in relation to local Turkish politics, right? It is politicized in terms of Turkish politics, right? But so in that sense, as Senay was saying, again, the root cause of displacement is actually concealed. It is depoliticized. So also in Turkey, basically, why Syrian refugees are now refugees is not discussed. So what this does is to reduce the refugee to only an identity of loss, to the identity of being only victims, to the identity of basically, they should always, be mourning and miserable and etc. So which means that they're not seen as people who have political agency, as people, who were struggling, and this is why they became refugees. So what this does is basically refugees are people whom you are not in solidarity with, but you're only helping. So it establishes a hierarchy between, let's say the local, I don't like the term that much, but, now for the sake of saving time, between, let's say, local activists and Syrian refugees, there is a relationship of hierarchy being established. So what we see is, a Syrian feminist, let's say, is not a feminist, but a refugee. Right. So a Syrian journalist is not a journalist, but a refugee. So a Syrian writer is not a writer, but a refugee. So it is always the refugee identity, which is defined, on the basis of victimhood, is what comes to the foreground. Also, what this implies is that, refugees are supposed to be only to be grateful to the locals and to the government, to the extent that it gives, and so they shouldn't be demanding any rights. They shouldn't be demanding dignity. They should just be, grateful to the fact that, the Turkish state decided to open its borders. So which also means that Syrian refugees should not express any opinion regarding Turkish politics, which is defined as, Turkey's internal politics, as if refugees are not part of Turkish politics and as if they're not affected by Turkish politics. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, that of course hits home because I lived in Turkey for almost 2 years, and of course I lived everything you're saying. And the identity, the question of identity, usually is it's a touchy subject because the identity of transition is usually very hard for immigrants to live with and to accept. And I remember in Turkey, like I had a hard time calling myself refugee. I only made peace with the fact after coming to the US. So, but it's really interesting because also I know that Omar Dahi works on, his research interests are in like political economy and development and comparative regionalism. So I love the comparative regionalism part. What do you think? How can you like compare right now and what we're talking, since we mentioned the issue of immigrants within the U.S. and Syrian refugees in neighboring countries? Can you like answer the first question in that regard?
Yeah, sure. And thank you again so much for having me in this panel. I'm glad to be here. Yeah, I mean, I guess as my colleagues have mentioned, you know, the refugee question is often politicized. The question is, how is it politicized in different contexts, and who is politicizing it, and for what ends? I mean, in terms of depoliticization, you often see, for example, international organizations or charitable organizations trying to depoliticize for various reasons. I think in many cases they do so because they operate in different countries where they feel that the best thing to do is to stay away from politics, because then they would be forced to criticize the country that they're working in. And over time, that ends up compromising in all sorts of ways that are negative, because they don't highlight issues like root causes. They don't highlight issues of political oppression. States have, you know, their own logics of when they want to or not want to talk about the refugee issue. So often it's depoliticized that way. But I think, as my colleagues have said, you know, the refugee issue is often seized upon by right-wing forces, for example, to politicize it and scapegoat refugees, such as what we saw in Europe, such as what we see in the US, to scapegoat refugees for all sorts of economic ills. You see the rise of racism and xenophobia in many of these countries. So it's politicized in all sorts of ways, when sometimes as activists, we want to do a couple things. First, which is, as mentioned by Justin and others, to talk about the broader causes of displacement, not just in terms of wars and armed conflict, but mass displacement that is tied to global hierarchies of power and imperialism and uneven trade agreements and transnational war economies in terms of weapons sales and in terms of military interventions. And the second thing is, oftentimes, you know, we want to say that a humanitarian crisis is a humanitarian crisis. Like in Mexico right now, on the border, there's a humanitarian crisis of people who simply need help. And so we need to actually assist people who need help. And this is the case, you know, when we talk about refugees coming from Syria. I mean, often there's this question of, okay, what is their politics? And, you know, I mean, how do we think about politicizing it? Whereas, you know, there are people who actually need assistance, who need help, and we need to reach out to that. But I would say the second issue here is what Senay has brought up, which is that refugees themselves are political actors in many cases. And we saw, of course, in the case of Syrian displacement, that you saw various sectors of Syrian society, including many activists who were active, let's say, against the government inside Syria, who fled because of the political choices that they made. And once they were in neighboring countries or abroad, they took up, you know, they organized themselves. They tried to voice their political perspectives. They created organizations that were advocacy. So I think thinking about the agency of this, of people who are displaced, and trying to hear their voices and trying to support their organizing and trying to listen to sort of what their demands are, I think is really an important thing as well in terms of how we think about this question of politicization.
Thank you so much, Omar. I mean, you touched upon how refugees and immigrants in recent history challenged the system of borders, but also the system of borders that also includes, you know, problems within each country that they didn't really choose to be in. And these challenges and usually are very politicized, and they affect the refugees themselves, as you mentioned. I would like to ask everyone if you can mention how had refugees and immigrants in recent history challenged the system of borders in each of the regions that you specialize in. I'll start with Justin.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a really important key issue because, speaking from the point of view of the U.S., the U.S. has a history of incorporating immigrant and migrant and refugees as the working class in this country, and this has only become this has only continued and increased into the 21st century. So in part, I would say because of the fact that immigrant, migrant, and refugee peoples have entered into the ranks of the working class and at different epochs, including the one that we're in, have been at the forefront of labor militancy and organizing. This is in part, I would argue, why there is the sort of development of the infrastructure of repression in the United States. I talk about this concept called bordered capitalism, where capitalism is now, as a function of capitalism, borders are established, and immigration restriction and regulation is now a region-wide phenomenon. But U.S. capitalism now depends on exploiting workers in Central America in what are called maquiladoras and sweatshops, where they assemble things like where they create and assemble and put together things like clothes and components for cars and things like that. And so there's this heavy capital investment in these regions by U.S. multinationals and U.S. investment firms. And then there's the exploitation of workers after they cross borders. So there's Central American workers and Mexican workers in maquiladoras in Mexico. There's Mexican and Central American workers in factories in the United States. So there's this kind of extension of the U.S. capitalist system. But if we look back at the recent U.S. history, if we go back to the 1980s, there was a significant transition in the United States where, as especially Central American, Mexican especially, but also Central American Caribbean workers became more integrated into various industries, and they were not yet, their presence was not yet criminalized the way we understand it today. Some unions began to help those workers organize and began to bring them into their unions. So by 1986, there was a major division in the union movement in this country, with a number of forward-looking unions rejecting immigration controls and now basically supporting undocumented workers, and helped facilitate, the passage of an amnesty, which brought about 3 million workers into legalization. Well, these workers made up the ranks of, they made up the sort of new ranks of the labor movement. And so immigrants flooded into the unions, and it kicked off a period in which we see the growth of those unions that organize immigrant workers, and we begin to see a significant change in the immigrant, in the union sort of position towards undocumented workers, so that by 2000, the AFL-CIO officially supported legalization and incorporation of immigrant workers into their unions. So the last point I'll make is we saw another surge of immigrant workers in 2006, where over 3 million workers in this country went on strike, walked out, marched for another legalization. And, this is basically the next generation of the labor movement here, right? And so this is in part why I argue that the repression has been so heavy in the United States. I mean, there's a long history of racism. I mean, we are a settler colonial, slave-owning origin nation, but a lot of the sort of recent sort of repressive apparatus is in fact a reflection of the desire of the state to repress these workers and to prevent a sort of further development of the labor movement, and by extension, further politicization and organization of immigrant working class communities. So I think these things are correlated, and that's why we have free movement for capital from the United States to Honduras, but we have the regulated and policed and restricted and repressed movement of peoples. And in fact, the U.S. Border Patrol now has operations through Mexico to Guatemala, right? So the policing of migrants now extends across several countries. And so this is, sort of what we're facing in the United States. And the immigrant workers are, there's a lot of repression, but there's still significant resistance. Even in the detention centers in the last year, we've seen over 30 hunger strikes of refugees and immigrants in detention centers, basically opposing the conditions that they've been facing. So this is a very big part of the movement here, the leadership of immigrants, refugees, and migrants.
Thank you, Justin. Since we are talking about the U.S. and Senay, you are based in the U.S., but also we all know not a lot of numbers in Syrian refugees can even get to the U.S. It's really extremely hard to seek asylum in the United States. So how does that affect on the movements, if you think? I mean, you can also talk about Europe as well, since you have knowledge, but within the U.S., how do they make themselves heard, and how they try to challenge the system of borders in the United States and in United States policies?
Yeah. Thank you. I think I will actually probably going to talk more on it globally, like in different regions. But I mean, Justin talked about really how migrant workers have been challenging the system, the border system, and as he mentioned, and really the bottom line is that those systems, the way they were put in first place, like up to questioning, colonialism and global north, like top bottom approaches, and so the systems in themselves are a problem. And so how refugees and migrants have been challenging the system, I think the moment you become a refugee, you're challenging borders. The moment you step out of your home, and you cross by foot or by sea, whether to Turkey, Jordan, or Lebanon, or you take them, the boat to Europe, you are challenging borders. And so the issue of forced displacement by nature is, and by default, immediately it challenges the notion of borders, and it put it at questioning, because we have the border system that was constructed, if we go historically, how it was constructed and who constructed it, and then the nation state and Westphalian, and these are all Western notions that were not developed by the people, they were not developed by local, and we cannot talk about immigration and forced displacement and refugees without going back to those histories. Like, you cannot talk about anything in the US without addressing slavery. You cannot talk about anything in Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America without addressing colonialism. And so the root causes really resides there. And I think we don't lack any resistance from refugees and migrants at all to this system. And as I said, like, just the moment you step out, you're challenging. Your own existence as a refugee in a host country is resistance. It's challenging the system. However, there have been as well, like, more organized efforts where refugees and migrants have been challenging the system in different ways, like actually like speaking up against the system when it's possible. And I would say that the main issue here is that the system itself, as we said, was not designed by the people. So the system is exclusive. And until this moment, the refugee response sector and any conversation of forced displacement is exclusive. It's a white Anglo conversation. The solutions are like done by people in Geneva, and the speakers are, white experts on refugee issues. And so there's no pathways actually for refugees and migrants to be part of the conversation. And so that's something, for example, in the Global Refugee-Led Network, which myself and other refugees have started, it's all about meaningful participation and right for self-representation. And it has been, we have been building up, of course, on efforts of other refugees and migrants for decades. And so, but personally, like, for the past 5 years, I think I'm dedicated to, let's stop talking about tokenistic participation. Let's stop inviting the one refugee to tell the inspiring story. I mean, why do I tell the story about why I'm on a panel to tell a story where another non-refugee on a panel to say what does it feel to be a refugee and what the solution for the refugee crisis? And so, as Senay mentioned in the beginning, like, Syrian writers become refugees. Syrian businesswomen and men became just refugees. And so that's the issue. The system is really systematically exclusive. And so we have to systematically dismantle this exclusion to make the system more inclusion. And that's why solidarity, like in the network we work with refugees and migrants in Latin America and Southeast Asia and Africa. It's very important that it's a global movement towards dismantling barriers towards meaningful inclusion and right for self-representation for refugees. Because the bottom line, if the solution is not designed by the people who are affected by it, then the solutions are not effective. And I think we have like 70 years proof of that. And so it's about time to change that.
Yeah, and it's really hard to make change when you don't even have papers and you don't even have a say and you can't vote and you can't be heard even. I would like to shift, I think Omar would answer that question perfectly, is the Gaza's Great Return March, for example, in the Palestine, since we haven't really touched on the Palestinian side of things, even though they have been one of the, oldest displaced peoples. So if anyone would like to pitch in about the situation of Gaza and how they are even challenging, and not just Gaza, of course, all of Palestine within the region. I mean, for example, I see a lot here in the U.S. I've seen a lot of efforts that are being done by Palestinians. They are learning and how to affect U.S. policy by, for example, lobbying, and that's really inspiring because as Syrians, we're like the newcomers and we're like learning from the ones who came before us. So it's really interesting to see that how Palestinians have learned since 48 how to be heard, and of course it's every region and every peoples have their own special positionality and everything. But if Omar, you would like to discuss that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think thank you for raising that. And I think when we look at protracted refugee situations, I think as someone had mentioned earlier on, and in terms of politicization, I mean, when talking about the Palestinian refugees, you saw the not only the fact that Palestinian refugees, unlike most other refugees, are not recognized or are not assisted in the clinging to their right of return, which is something that they've held on to and something that they've insisted on since the Nakba, since the next 1948 establishment of Israel and 1967 wars. But if you look at, for example, the Trump administration's actions, going back to Justin's notion of the authoritarian, fascistic, or repressive regimes, one of the first things that they did was trying to attack, for example, UNRWA and defund UNRWA. So rather than this continued attack on them, even as refugees, it's not just the fact that they have been displaced for decades, but a continuous attack on their rights as refugees and their livelihoods and their basic funding that helps them survive. In the case of Gaza, for example, Gaza itself is mostly composed of refugees. 7 out of 10 people in Gaza is a refugee. I mean, it's talked about as one of the world's largest prisons because it's completely surrounded and people don't have the ability to move, and they're routinely once every 4 or 5 years, Israel attacks and destroys the infrastructure there. But it's important to remember that the Gazans are mostly themselves refugees displaced from historic Palestine. And I think one of the things that you saw in the crisis of displacement, that at least in the Syrian conflict, you saw a lot of solidarity, at least, for example, in the cases of Lebanon, when I did a lot of research in 2012, 13, and 14, in various places in Lebanon, including Shatila camp, for example, you saw a lot of mutual support by Palestinian organizations, for example, who were active in the camps supporting newly displaced Syrian refugees. Many of them were Syrian, some of them were Palestinian refugees in Syria who were twice or three times displaced from, for example, the Yarmouk camp. So I think it's, as we look at these struggles, it's good to look at the overlaps, it's good to look at the solidarities, and also, as my colleagues mentioned, the root causes of these. How do we think about and tie the root causes of displacement? And they vary. It's different from different refugee populations. The solutions will vary and how we tackle it. But I think it's important to use that comparative perspective and the lens in order to think more deeply about the crisis of displacement overall.
Thank you so much, Omar. Senay, we've talked about this a lot, and you already touched on it, so this is why I left you to the end. But if you would like to say or mention how have you finding Syrians within Turkey organizing in order to be heard and to be political agents within Turkey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well. Again, that has a lot to do with, with the changing political scene in Turkey. I mean, especially in the last 4 years, basically since the failed military coup, a lot of the civic space in Turkey has closed down upon us, unfortunately. A lot of the civil society organizations have been shut down. So the judiciary has totally lost its independence, and political parties are under threat, and so political and civic activism is the space for political and civic activism has really shrunk to a tremendous level, and obviously this also affects Syrian refugees as well. I mean, a lot of you know very well, the situation of Syrian civil society organizations in Turkey, right? I mean, so they are basically many of them are not able to get work permits, for example, for their employees. So they are under threat of either being basically detained or closed down or deported, etc. And other than that, so basically maybe only a part of the Syrian opposition in Turkey, which is probably closer to Turkish government's policies, is tolerated. But at the same time, you never know who is being tolerated and to what degree and until when that political movement is going to be tolerated, because nothing is really guaranteed nothing is guaranteed by right. So therefore, it is only tolerated. And this also makes it, this is basically on top of, the opposition in Turkey since the start, which it was not necessarily interested in establishing basically channels of solidarity with Syrian opposition in Turkey, because as I was saying, the situation was extremely politicized in the sense that, a big chunk of the opposition in Turkey considered Syrian opposition to be in tandem with Erdogan's policies. So in that sense, the friend of my enemy is my enemy kind of a logic prevailed, unfortunately. So this has been the main problem in Turkey.
Thank you so much, Senay. We have a great question here from Danny Postel about your take also on, because you also lived several years and you taught, as I understood, in the refugee camp of Yarmouk in Damascus. And it is, if people don't know what the Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria is, populated mainly and solely by Palestinian refugees. Unfortunately, they do not really have many rights as Syrians. They are waiting for their right of return, which is really strips them from their rights within Syria. So if you'd like to talk more about that as well.
Actually, I wanted to mention also Palestinian refugees as the second displacement they also experienced. But to start with, this is also, we're all very well aware of how the Syrian regime has played the Palestinian card as well, right? And they're And but at the same time, how we know that the right of return was also used not to give full rights to Palestinian refugees in Syria, right? This is one thing. And right now we know what is happening in Yarmouk. We have been following the news yesterday and today, how there is a policy of basically getting rid of that of Yarmouk. But what I actually wanted to mention more was, how also not all refugees are the same, right? I mean, so the two categories we are dealing with are not just citizens versus refugees, but there are hierarchies among refugees themselves as well. And the bureaucratic categories, or the categories of the states that we were used to dealing with, citizen versus refugees, have also been shattered with Syrian displacement, right? I mean, for example, in Turkey, during the first year, nobody knew how to deal with Palestinian refugees, right? So Palestinian refugees from Syria came to Turkey. They went to UNHCR because there's no UNRWA in Turkey, and UNHCR refused to deal with them because they are under UNRWA, and but at the same time, at first they weren't able to get temporary protection in Turkey because they're not Syrian citizens. So really, they did not have any legal status. They weren't at first admitted to camps, or they were first admitted and then kicked out of camps and then readmitted, and etc. Or I mean, it was the same with some Kurdish refugees coming from Syria who did not have Syrian citizenship. It was the same situation, right? Because they're not Syrian citizens, then they weren't under temporary protection, they couldn't be registered, and etc. So basically, both Palestinian refugees and those Kurds who did not have Syrian citizenship who came to Turkey, they both basically shattered all the borders between Syrian and refugee citizens and refugees, because they were not citizens in the first place to start with, right? If in the country where they were displaced from. So basically, in summary, I think it is also important to highlight the fact that we're not dealing with only two categories, citizens versus refugees.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Thank you so much, Senay. So we've already talked about how refugees are challenging the system of borders, but we also seen a lot, and you've all mentioned a lot of amazing examples. Well, what do you think can the various movements today, whether for solidarity with Syrian refugees or for immigrants in the US, learn from these high points of struggles that we've all witnessed in the past 20 years or even more? And how can they form from each other's histories of fight back, also learn how to organize in the current moments and the current political problems?
Yeah, maybe I could
Yes, Senay.
Yeah. So I mean, I would say there's a lot to learn, but at the same time, we're still learning ourselves. And so I feel like movements, unfortunately, just never end because the struggle never ends. And so, so I feel like I think the question more is how can we collaborate more together? How can we coordinate and work more together? But definitely, even within the refugee movements, there are so many forcibly displaced communities that have been displaced for decades before Syrians. And so and that's why on my work personally, I've been focused on the global, because I noticed from these conversations I have with this forcibly displaced persons from Colombia and from Africa and from places in Afghanistan and all, there's so much to learn, and we are not alone in this, and we're not the first. And I feel to be frank, I feel we as the Syrian diaspora now, or the Syrian refugee community, we do feel this is the worst, never happened, and we're alone in it. We're not, for better or worse. And there's so much to learn. And these movements before, people and groups before us organized, and they have been doing a lot of work. So we are coming to a place where it's not starting from the beginning. There are existing actors that we could collaborate with, and most importantly, we do have roles to play. And so how can we also use our voice and privilege? Because as Senay has mentioned, even within the refugee communities, we're not all the same, and there's favorism, and there's classism, and there's global preferences about like the good refugee and the bad refugee. And so, you know, as Syrian refugee, we have our own privileges, even as refugees. And so how can we be aware of those ourselves as well, and how can we leverage them and work with other communities? And so I think that would be my answer to that. No.
Thank you so much, Sana. Justin, I also would like to touch on. Oh, we have an amazing actually question from the audience. With the greatest number of refugees and displaced people ever, the issue has become a worldwide crisis, and unfortunately, questions of race and class cross it in many ways. Brazil has been receiving peoples from all over, including Syria, and besides the difficulties they have faced, most of them have access to documentations and so on. Things impossible to the ones coming from Africa and Latin America. Could you comment on that based on your experience? I mean, I've already addressed Justin in that, but if anyone would like to discuss that, because we also have seen a lot of the videos and footage when Syrians were migrating and using boats. We also see a lot of people from African descent. So if you can discuss the racial question and within the refugee crisis of the world right now.
Yeah, I just wanted to start by going back to the question of the Palestinian, the historic Palestinian struggle. When Trump was elected or selected, he ran on a campaign of expanding the border wall, which in the United States was actually first initiated by a Democratic president and Congress, and has since been extended by both Republicans and Democrats. So he took bidders to build the extension of the wall, and one of the bidders was an Israeli company called Magal Security Systems Limited, who is responsible for building most of the border walls between around Gaza and the West Bank. So the international connections of repression, are very clear. And in Mexico, where there's a lot of opposition to the wall, there's an acute awareness of the similarities, between what they're facing, to some degree, and other people in the world who are facing walls being built around them. Things we can learn from each other. I mean, I think there's a lot, and one of them is, it's already been a theme here, is international solidarity. The other is, an unequivocal opposition to borders and the need to get rid of borders. Borders as zones of repression, zones of death. Here in the U.S.-Mexico border, we have people dying every day trying to cross, and these borders sort of underpin. They're legislated into existence, but they're underpinned. And they underpin the whole apparatus of racism and repression, that exists. And so, and it's like an anchor, in the United States, it's a big anchor on the left, because we have two political parties that essentially are two different sort of wings of they represent different configurations of the capitalist class. And as I mentioned previously, borders are now a factor in terms of how capitalism accumulates on a region-wide basis, and so that narrows the sort of discourse, and in the sort of left wing of the Democratic Party, and adhere to that, still, sort of collapse their sort of critique, at that point, and instead, talk about like humanitarian, the need for more humanitarian aid, or the end of the worst excesses, but we're not going to be able to proceed unless we actually talk about the need to dismantle and abolish these repressive the repressive apparatus of the state. And just by way of connecting to the question of race, I think much of the world is aware that there's a rebellion happening in the United States right now, led by Black and African American people, and this is a very significant historic thing in U.S. history. I would argue that much of the progress towards justice and equality in this country has been framed by rebellions like these, and it's interesting how the sort of repression of migrants and the police repression of Black and Latinx people in this country is bringing these struggles together. And for instance, there's been these hunger strikes and different forms of protests in these for-profit detention centers that are stretched across the country. And one here in California recently, the people who were going on a hunger strike because COVID-19, basically people have been left to get infected. They have done very little to protect people in detention centers. Again, these are mostly for-profit run institutions where they leave people to languish and get infected, and they provide very little in the way of protection. But during a hunger strike, one group at a place at a detention center called Mesa Verde, as part of their announcement to the world of why they were going on hunger strike, they said, and I'm quoting here, "In memory of our comrades George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Oscar Grant, and Tony McDade, almost all of us have suffered through our country's corrupt and racist criminal justice system before being pushed into the hands of ICE." So these kind of connections are really crucial, in terms of building solidarity within borders and across borders. And I think that this, and the very last point I want to make is why this is so important. Just a few days ago, it was released in the United States. It made it into the news that the Trump administration is distributing federal troops to cities across the country, operating under very shadowy rules and basically disappearing protesters off the streets. It just happened in Portland a few nights ago. And it turns out that these agents are Border Patrol agents. They're Border Patrol agents who are now being deployed in cities, and they operate under a different set of guidelines that allows them to arrest people who are suspected of, very vague wording, but anybody who's arrested as being in conflict with the United States can be arrested and detained without charge. And so Border Patrol agents are operating, and they're now sort of pulling people off the streets, because the way the federal law works is they can operate within 100 miles of the border. And 100 miles of the border around the United States includes 2/3 of the U.S.'s population. So all these connections are being made by how the state operates, and why solidarity, and opposing the borders alongside of the police, and the need to defund and dismantle, how that's been raised as an actual political demand can also be transferred to the struggle for immigrant, migrant, and refugee rights.
Thank you. I mean, yes, we see a lot of the racial question being, of course, brought up when it comes to, whiteness mainly. When we see refugees going to Europe or the U.S. But there's always this different question when it comes to immigrants, for example, in Syria, migrating or being displaced and having to go to another Arab country, for example. So if you, Omar, can touch on that as well, like how does the racial question factor within that situation in your own experience and research?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I think it's an important issue now to think about in light of the rebellion that is taking place in the U.S., as Justin mentioned. There was a lot of reflection within the Arab American community, prompted by the incident that the person who called the cops on George Floyd, the store owner, was of Palestinian origin, who he since then supported the Black Lives Matter and said that he would not have, it was an employee, it wasn't himself. But that prompted a lot of soul searching among the community about anti-Blackness within the Arab countries, within Arab Americans. And from my experience, for example, there was a clear hierarchy of refugees, of who is more visible and who is invisible in the Arab countries and elsewhere in Europe, in terms of who's a proper refugee and who is an economic migrant, for example. And often these are conditioned by, again, these global structures of funding and power, and who do European and North American institutions decide are refugees worthy of support and who are not. This is not to say that some refugees were in luxury and others were not. I mean, in general, their conditions were not great. But in the case, for example, of Jordan, Jordan has refugees from, for example, Syria, Iraq at some point, Yemen, Somalia, and Sudan. And it was clear, for example, of who are the refugees who have least, or the migrants who have the least rights, or the least recognition, and who has the most. And it was, again, conditioned by who does international funding structures and politicization says who is the refugees that deserve interventions and who doesn't. And this is, of course, not just international, from within these countries as well. From within the structures and the states of those countries as well, they have this hierarchy. And I think this is something that, and of course, this is not just about refugees, but domestic workers, migrant workers who work in Lebanon, who work in the Gulf, the semi-bondage system or the bondage system where their rights are minimal or non-existent, their travel documents are confiscated, and they live in essentially serf-like conditions in some cases. And again, lots of people have attempted to shed light on these crises. So I think, it's important as we are focusing on this issue to look at, that within these categories there are hierarchies, and we need to think about our how we set it up and how we do our analysis, not to recreate and make certain invisible people twice or three times invisible through our analysis.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, we received another question about how oppressive regimes as well use these terms that are actually different in different cultures when it comes to race, when it comes to other things, to actually confuse and whitewash their own image in the West, let's say. And I hate to use that West versus East binary, but so the Syrian regime, for example, used the Palestinian part a lot, and I think we really touched on that in the last webinar, Imperialism and Anti-Imperialism and the Syrian Revolution, with the great thinker Yassin al-Hajj, I believe. So if you can also talk about how that, I mean, within right now, the COVID situation, I mean, that's a totally different thing, but in the COVID situation and the global pandemic, how had the current global pandemic exposed the problematic basis of borders in each region that we have just discussed in the last hour? If we can start with Senay in Turkey.
Yeah. So, well, the main issue about Syrian refugees and COVID in Turkey has been that an overwhelming majority of Syrian refugees in Turkey are working without work permits. So when in March, the Turkish government basically announced the COVID package, basically Syrian workers could not benefit from it because they were not working, they were working informally. So the COVID package basically included, said that, no one can be fired from their jobs. So this was one. But we know that around 70% of Syrian refugees in Turkey already lost their jobs in the last 4 months. And so they couldn't benefit from this because they were not, officially working anyway. So this is one. Second item on the COVID package was that, so basically the state, basically the financial aid each worker is receiving. Again, Syrian refugees could not benefit from this because they were not officially working. So these two are among the main issues. But other than that, I mean, we're all aware of the class dimension of COVID. And so in Istanbul as well, which is a city of around 20 million people, so Istanbul was hit hardest in Turkey, and within Istanbul, it was obviously the working class neighborhoods which were hit hardest by COVID, due to living conditions in these neighborhoods, and also because people were forced to, some of them were forced to go to work still. So and Syrian refugees mostly reside in working class neighborhoods, so they are probably among among the population that was hit the hardest. However, Well, this is a positive and a negative thing. We don't have statistics that tell us, how many Syrian refugees had COVID. So statistics do not differentiate, don't tell us like how many citizens and how many non-citizens had COVID. As far as I'm aware, there was not a problem in terms of accessing healthcare. And all COVID expenses or COVID cure hospital expenses are covered by the state for everyone, basically. So that is not an issue in Turkey for citizens and refugees alike. Nobody pays anything for if they're hospitalized because of COVID. That was not an issue, but we don't have clear statistics about like how many Syrians had COVID, what is the death rate and etc.
I mean, yes, even without a global pandemic, personally, I just recently, actually 2 days ago, I got my first health insurance in 6 years since I was displaced, and it's really like the question of healthcare and access to healthcare, and it's just shows a lot of how immigrants and refugees have to deal with the various problems of being of not fitting into the system of borders. Senay, you can also talk about that, because in the U.S., how are people dealing with this, and if you can touch also on Europe and within the global pandemic that we are facing.
Yeah, I know. I know I'm based in the US, but I work very little in the US. But I'm definitely, from my own experience as a refugee here, I could speak about it more. But I do think the question of race and COVID is a very important question. And despite, refugees, the conversation right now is about how marginalized communities have higher number of COVID cases than white communities, and that's like, that really, like, the question, the answer resides there. Marginalized communities, including communities of color, Black communities, Hispanic communities, informal workers, refugees, and other categories. And so refugees communities are part of those marginalized communities, and just the system. I don't want to make it about the US, but for example, yes, in the US, healthcare, it's a big issue not only for refugees. Healthcare is the conversation, and that gets politicized, that every single president uses it and every single president tries to address it, and so it's a bigger issue than refugee communities. But refugee communities, are part of the communities that get affected by the current healthcare system that's just designed for certain groups. So it's a capitalist system. So, like, just to highlight that. But I guess, like, to talk about maybe the situation and COVID, like for refugees right now, with COVID. Before COVID, refugees had no access to healthcare, and especially I would talk about refugees in host countries, and so in the Middle East and in Latin America, and not talking refugees probably in Europe and in America. But before that, the situation has been like dire, and the situation was really bad. So what you can just like take a moment to imagine, so what's the situation after COVID? And so the luxury of preventive measures such as social distancing, masks, and gloves are luxury. They just don't have them as well. Like the level of starvation, probably we all been hearing about things that in Lebanon, people, refugees, committing suicides, and even local marginalized groups as well. So, the level of poverty has increased, especially with refugees, and shrinking of rights, as we were talking about rights, limited mobility. So, for example, in Jordan, they had this, curfew law about early on about, you can't like walk after a certain hour. And, a lot of the refugees don't have this choice. Like they have to go to these exploitive jobs to be able to feed their families. They don't, COVID, not COVID, they have to go to these exploitive places. And even to go to these exploitive places, they couldn't because of the curfew. And so what happened is, like, who got detained by breaking these curfews? Refugees. And so many of them have not received legal representation, and they have been fined without even having means to pay for this. And so the level of exploitation on that level even increased. And then maybe like about generally refugee access to healthcare, and maybe I will talk in our region. Like in theory, a number of major host countries, such as like Jordan and Turkey, have announced that everyone should have access to COVID testing, including refugees, despite their legal status. That's in theory. I mean, like Lebanon is even a different category. That doesn't even exist in theory for Lebanon. But my point is that even in theory, when a number of countries have announced that refugees have access to COVID testing, refugees still did not come forward. And there's a reason, there are reasons for this. And one of them is that, you know, they have experienced xenophobia and traumatizing experiences for decades, whether when dealing with national systems, trying to have access to public services, or simply existing in these countries. So there's no trust, basically, between refugees and host country national systems. And so how like their questions would be, you know, they treat us badly. How do we know that now if we go to the health facility with fear of COVID and, you know, fear-mongering around COVID, that we won't be treated worse? There's the fear of detention. You know, if they come forward, like, you know, the people are already, you know, are already exploited. They have no rights. And so there's fear of detention. And there's also fear of deportation. And that, you know, especially in Jordan and in Turkey, and of course in Lebanon, like, even if you say in theory, like, I can come forward and do a COVID test, I will be treated, I would be definitely scared of being deported back, because now I'm like, you know, the one who has the virus. And so there's a lot of barriers that prevent refugees of coming forward, because even in theory, those governments have put, you know, have said refugees could have access. And the root cause of this fear is lack of documentation, lack of legal status, lack of rights. And so but this also represents an opportunity, I think, for us, those who work on these issues, that now we could talk more and make the case, because of COVID, that including refugees and government response plans, and including refugees in national systems, whether healthcare system, giving refugees safe and equal access to those systems, it's a win-win. Because if anything, COVID is the only example that actually, if not all your members of communities of the community are healthy, just the community is not healthy. So if host governments do not address those barriers towards access to healthcare, and they do not address COVID within marginalized communities, including refugee and migrant workers, and then their communities would never be healthy. So that's an opportunity for us as an activist and advocates to actually advocate more for this, and use the COVID case to build a bigger goal around inclusion and regularization of refugees in national systems.
Thank you so much, Sana. I mean, Omar, I know you specialize in economics. I'd like to ask, because, you know, the global pandemic affected economics so much, but how does that even, like, under the umbrella of the pandemic and the economic crisis, how are refugees affected under these two issues?
Well, in addition to what's been said, I would say that, you know, observing how states used COVID as a pretext to further clamp down, obviously, on borders and refugee rights, and to set into, to start measures that would, you know, further inhibit their ability in terms of their mobility or in terms of their right to stay. And I think we've seen that happening in the neighboring countries, certainly in Lebanon. We saw a complete shutdown of the borders for, you know, people to enter and leave the country. But at the same time, the government just released a couple of days ago a plan or approved a plan to facilitate or to encourage or, you know, to set in motion a process of return of Syrian refugees from Lebanon to Syria. And I think, you know, although the plan pays lip service that it's going to be a voluntary return, but in reality, in terms of the outline of the plan and in terms of many of the elements, it's basically essentially going to look more and more like there's going to be lots of communities who are going to be forced back, whether they like it or not, to have that return, and the pressure is going to be further increasing. And I think, you know, part of what's happening is in moments of crisis like these, governments feel a freer hand to set these policies in motion, again, under the pretext of public health, or under the pretext of economic crisis, or under the pretext of national security. All of these to a certain extent, have been used over time as ways to clamp down on the rights of migrants and refugees. And I think part of the work that you had a question before this one about what can we do and to learn from these struggles. And I think one of the things we can do is to learn about what is the national sentiment. And Lebanon had a really a vast social movement since October of last year due to the financial crisis, an uprising challenging economic corruption, inequalities, neoliberalism, challenging the ruling oligarchy. And that uprising was an expression of the Lebanese public sentiment. And they didn't mention the Syrian refugees as a problem. That was not on their list of things that they were objecting to, in fact. So for years, we've been hearing in Lebanon that there's a anti-refugee sentiment, and certainly certainly exists. It's not absent. But when Lebanese society had a chance to express itself across sectarian lines, they did not make attacking the refugees or critiquing them or scapegoating them a priority, in a sense. Now, in reality, it's, things are complicated, I understand, but I think the more we look at what are the needs of society in terms of justice, in terms of economic equality, there's an organization, there's an initiative in Lebanon called Refugees Equals Partners, and it's a partnership between the Syrian Center for Policy Research and the Lebanese Economic Association. So it's a Syrians in Lebanon who are undertaking collaborative research to show the myths around refugee presence, that refugees had not been a drain on the Lebanese economy, that refugees have not been the cause of all the ills that are ascribed to them. So this solidarity work, this organizing on the ground, this trying to increase justice, trying to things that are not just issues of refugees, but of the broader working class and the poor, and highlighting them, I think, are what we should do to counteract those pretexts that are used in times of crisis to clamp down on refugees, but also on other marginalized populations.
Thank you so much, Omar. I know, Shana, you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a point to what Senay said. I mean, I totally agree with everything she said. I just wanted to add that even, under populist authoritarian regimes, even like legal status no longer means anything, really. It is not a guarantee of anything, right? I mean, like even as citizens, like, even, all the rights are very precarious. So even like displaced people who have, let's say, refugee status, it's even that is extremely precarious. So it is states, who, as long as it is states who decide who is legal and who is not illegal, legality, as much as obviously it makes a difference, definitely someone who has papers and, doesn't have a paper obviously makes a difference. But at the same time, under such regimes, that status becomes extremely precarious. So what actually makes a big difference is the solidarity, rather than trusting the legality that these populist authoritarian regimes are granting to in quotation granting to people.
Thank you so much, Senay. We had a really great questions about the gendered aspect of the refugee experience. Could you talk about the uneven forms of violence that refugees or migrant men and women experience? Sana, if you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I always find the gender question is interesting because, I do feel, and I think that as refugees and really like male, men, women do experience a lot of things. And so like, I don't want to and women's are not necessarily like, the victims. And so I would just say maybe like, definitely we face as women different set of barriers. And of course we have so many battles. We have like dismantling the social structures and dismantling patriarchy and dismantling the system. And so definitely we have so many battles that we're facing and we're working on. But I would say like, if you look I could speak about the Syrian women work. It's really, really, really inspiring, not in a tokenistic way, but it's actually like badass work. Syrian women from day one, we've been, you know, planning protests and participating in shaping the revolution. And, you know, when women had to hold guns, they did. When they had to protect their kids, they did. When they had to organize, they did. And, you know, when they had to flee, leaving behind everything, and, you know, especially when their, you know, husbands, like my father, been taken, they adapted to severe circumstances. And so you see what keeps families together, once, like, refugee families, is actually the women in the families. And then, you know, they come and they have to learn another language, and they have to, you know, like, to find the work, and then all these battles. And of course, it depends on age, you face different things. But for example, on the question of like harassment, and on the question of exploitation, it does happen with all people, despite their gender. And if we want to talk, like, I have so many male friends, Syrians, who actually like have trauma from rape in detention centers. And we're not talking about access to mental health for men. So if actually, like, the gendered conversation is important to also, like, when we talk about people who suffered, who've been through something, I think it's very important to talk about all, because the Syrian regime in detention centers, they don't know men and women. You know, they don't know any of that. But I do think if we want to talk about the role that Syrian women have played in shaping the revolution, and then after, and keeping their families together, and in thriving in new countries, and being political actors, and then there's so much to say about this. And we have so many great examples, you know, including yourself, Sarah, here. And we have a lot of other amazing examples of Syrian women who really have come and have been still trying to overcome a lot of internalized and external social, political, and cultural barriers.
Of course, you too, Sa, your story, and your sisters also. I'd like to give a shout out to her because she's amazing as well. Wafa. It's just also, I'd like to just add that it's not easy. I mean, women have been inspiring not because, you know, it's been easy. It's because we had to fight on multiple levels, even within our own movements. So that has been really a teaching moment in the Syrian Revolution, and I'm sure in other revolutions as well. The gender question is a very important question to ask and to notice. So thank you all so much for all of your comments and your expertise. I learned so much from you all. Thank you, Omar, Senay, Sana, and Justin. I would like to show the works of our panelists. We have Omar's book, The South-South Trade and Finance in the 21st Century. And I'd like to also show off Justin's book, No One is Illegal. And I would also like to thank the organizations that sponsored this event, Solidarity and Borderless Magazine and Punto Rojo Magazine. And I would also like to stress our next webinar and panel, and it is titled The Struggles for Kurdish Liberation in Syria and the Region. The speakers will include Ozden Goner, Dilshad Othman, Kamran Matin, and Thomas Schmeidinger, and I'm so sorry about butchering your name. Thank you so much. It will be on Wednesday, July the 22nd at 2 p.m. And thank you to everyone who watched us today. It was an absolute pleasure to be among you. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, Sarah, and everyone.